Many food writers spend years building a platform in order to be noticed. But for today's guest, all it took was one single tweet about a cupcake. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. This is Molly Stevens, and today Kate Leahy and I are here to talk to a debut author whose book on Filipino-American desserts is getting a lot of attention, and for very good reason. Kate, I'm so glad to do this episode with you because I believe you told me that you have firsthand experience of Filipino food and flavors. Am I right?
You're so right. Actually, it was my first food memories were in the Philippines.
Wow. We
lived there when I was very young, and my favorite dessert of all time really was coconut sticky rice,
Wow.
served with mango. We lived in the southern Philippines, and I really wasn't exposed to American food until pretty much kindergarten. So all those memories of those flavors, from the crispy fish, the rice we'd eat for breakfast, to the desserts, are just like part of my understanding of world flavors. So that's why I can't wait to hear a little bit more about Abby's, how she created her desserts.
Well, I have never been to the Philippines, but I am pretty excited to talk to today's guest. Today, we're talking to Abi Balingit, and Abi is the young Filipino-American woman behind the blog, The Dusky Kitchen. And she started her blog right at the beginning of the pandemic. She was discovered by an agent. We'll get her to tell us all about that. But she has her first cookbook, Mayumu, Filipino-American Desserts Remixed, is just out last month.
What's so great is that we'll get to talk to Abby all about how this book came to be. And I think what's really exciting about talking about this book in particular is it shows that it's not too late to start a blog and start doing the food you really like. You can get a book out of that. We've sort of learned from seeing this book come to market.
Yeah, and she's got, we always talk about platform on this podcast, but Abby's got, she's got followers, but it's not huge.
It's not a million.
It's not a million. And I'm guessing it's going to grow with this book.
Right.
We're going to talk to her about learning as you go as a debut author. Well, Abby, hi, and welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
Congratulations on this book. It's beautiful, and we can't wait to dive in.
Thank you. And so much to talk about. I'm here for it. I'm all ready.
All right.
Abby, a lot of our listeners want to know how a debut author first gets recognized for their cooking, their baking, whatever their skill is. And in the introduction to your book, you explained that early on in the pandemic, you were discovered by a literary agent through a tweet.
Yeah.
Which is so crazy.
I know. It is kind of wild. Honestly, my whole baking career, though I started baking when I was 13, I think actually posting and actively kind of sharing what I was making was the summer of 2020. Emmy, my agent, found me I posted a Lao Gan Ma chili crisp cupcake recipe. I posted on Twitter, and then they were like, oh, this is amazing. Have you thought about writing a cookbook? And I started my blog August 2020, and this is maybe October.
Wow.
So it was so early on that I was I haven't really thought about that, but now you've given me an idea here. So I definitely reached out and followed up with them. And, they're based in Toronto. I'm based in New York. So we've never met in real life. The book is out, and it's kind of remarkable that even though it feels, very much like a virtual kind of thing, I still feel I feel like I got a sense of who they were and that they were really just passionate about what I'm doing and actually believed that I could write a book. So I really think their faith in that, and obviously their hard work in submitting this to editors, negotiating things for me, I don't think I could have done that at that kind of capacity by myself. I don't know much about, the actual back end of being in the industry, but I think it's so helpful to have an agent who's advocating for you and also has all the contacts that you would have. It's just a great overall good experience to kind of put your feet out there, but with someone holding your hand, kind of.
Well, let me ask you about the timeline, because you started your blog summer 2020 and you were noticed fall of 2020. Did I get that right?
Yes, that is true.
But that's when your agent reached out to you. And then the book deal, that came in 2022. Is that when it happened, or?
Actually earlier, I would say. Okay. So basically, got signed to the agency, Westwood Creative Artists. Love them. That was basically November 2020. And then actually kind of writing the proposal and finishing it was kind of January to May 2021. And then Emmy had submitted it to all these editors. And, talks go on when you're talking to each other. They're trying to like, you're pitching, they're pitching kind of a thing. And so I basically like agreed with my publisher right now is Harvest, an imprint of HarperCollins. And so like that kind of happened maybe July 2021. And then like actually getting a contract in place was kind of a long haul just because like initially they were actually an imprint with Hoot and Mifflin. And so then the whole acquisition happened. They got acquired by HarperCollins. So it was like a whole thing on the back end, which obviously wasn't like anything wrong, but I knew it was just like so much like paperwork and all this stuff that needed to be fine tuned, I guess. And so that actual contract signed and delivered was like December 2021. And actually talking to my editor and like writing and recipe development was January 2022 until like May 2022. And then edits 3 months or so after, 4 months. I feel like it finally was like sent off to printers like November 2022. So just a couple months ago, I guess, in retrospect.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That is pretty amazing.
That's all very fast.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say, you all probably know a lot more about these timelines than I do, but it did feel very fast for me as well.
I learned something new on every single episode because there's no one way that these work. And I'm just, we'll get into how you actually created all these beautiful recipes in such a tight timeline, because sometimes people have to have like their manuscript done and then it's a year before it hits bookshelves. So this is pretty cool. And Harvest is just an amazing imprint to have your name attached to. So, and of course, Molly and I were gushing over your cover, which is this beautiful baked Alaskan hollow. So people can check out. We'll have links to the book on the show notes. So everyone should take a look at what the cover looks like, because it really kind of, it just is so colorful and bright. And it really kind of also seems to mirror your personality and the personality you put in the stories.
Oh,
yeah. I want to go back to this proposal, though, Abby, if we can, because my understanding is when Emmy reached out to you, you hadn't really thought you'd become a cookbook connoisseur a little bit, or you've got a good collection of cookbooks. I think I heard you on the Cherry Bomb podcast talk about how once you had a little disposable income, even though you learned a lot on TV Food Network, but cookbooks are a little bit your jam right now. So you had a sense of them, but you hadn't thought of writing your own one.
No, not until that point. Yeah. And it was kind of something where the proposal itself was kind of like, well, it's kind of just a continuation of what I'm doing, or what I was doing on the blog, The Dusky Kitchen, that I was running, and I'm running still. I've just kind of been on hiatus with the book and everything. But yeah, I made a zine, maybe, I'm trying to think, it was like 2019, pre-pandemic, with my friends, and they're called Flash Thrive. They're like a collective, and they just like, do these zine fests out in Oakland, SF, San Diego. So I had written like a zine published through them, I guess. But it was very small, obviously, no hardback cover, just like literally office printer paper. And I did all the illustrations myself. And it was basically a dessert zine called Flipped Matamis. And Matamis means sweet in Tagalog. And my book, Mayumu, means sweet in Kapampangan. So I kind of wanted to make a distinction, but also feel like it's related to each of these projects.
And were there recipes in the zine?
There were, but honestly, they were more so. One of them was my dad's recipe for leche flan. My other one was like my mom's recipe for maja blanca, which is another Filipino dessert. And another one was kind of one that I had kind of tweaked from like the internet that wasn't necessarily like mine completely. But yeah, it was just meant to not be so much to make $1 million or anything, but it was more just like to like have shared with friends and like people who are interested in Filipino desserts. And I kind of also formatted the same way in my book, where I talk a little bit about my life and where I've lived. So that includes like the Bay Area, Stockton, and which is in Central California, and then also here in Brooklyn.
Right. So the zine became the seed for the proposal.
Yes, that was like pretty much my biggest work that I had to show, and also obviously the blog post too. But really, like, I think the whole thing with the proposal is that you don't necessarily have to have like 70 recipes ready. For this case, I think for this, we basically just like had 3 sample recipes or something to add onto it, so people can get a sense of like how you write and your head notes and all of that.
And how did you learn how to write recipes then? Because the recipes in your book, there's a lot of layers to them. There's a lot of components. And also, I think baking books are some of the hardest to write because of the technical aspects. But this comes across like you've been writing recipes for, the past decade. So how did you learn?
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's so flattering. I honestly think it was just like a lot of my sense of like baking, I think I talked about too earlier, was coming from baking blogs, Food Network, But doing research for this book, I was basically like, there are certain things where I'm like, how have people done this in the past? I don't want to like reiterate too much of what has already been done, but at the same time, like technique and everything, I was kind of like watching more YouTube videos, also reading like a baking Bible, I think I have somewhere here. But I just like was trying really hard to kind of like, it was a very fast timeline, but at the same time, I was still kind of like, well, I've done X many cake recipes before. I know the basic ingredients and ratios, but to make it work for what I wanted, I was basically like, this process of that process and kind of like Frankensteining things in my head that I had already kind of like absorbed from constantly just like baking other people's recipes. But I'm really glad, again, if I don't know what I'd do without the internet, to be honest, because I feel like that was my biggest source of just knowing things and having my own cookbook collection. I've been basically kind of the most focus I had was more on like Filipino cookbooks and seeing what they had in their dessert section, matching up with like, okay, like this is like seems like big tenets of Filipino cuisine and dessert specifically. But again, there's not as many of like only Filipino baking cookbooks. There's definitely more of a broad genre of just like general cooking. So it was more just so like matching up and kind of looking at them individually and being like, okay, I love this aspect of this book and the other aspect of this book, and I kind of want to combine this. So there's a lot more. I feel like in my head it seems like such a jumbled little thing that I just told y'all, but I swear there's like a process. I just don't know how to describe it as well.
No, that makes sense. It's like you're making all these connections in your head by saying, okay, this flavor combination, this texture, and they could be coming from 3 or 4 different recipes, but you're going to make it your own by figuring out how the puzzle fits together in a way. So it does become something new.
Yeah. I hope that's how it definitely is hopefully how I want it to come across, but that is exactly the kind of like thing that's going on in my head.
When you were writing the proposal and working with Emmy at the beginning, or maybe after you'd already signed, did you feel any pressure either from yourself or from your publisher or your agent to make it a more classic Filipino dessert book? Just because it's not, it's not a classic. And you mentioned that in your own Filipino cookbook collection, you looked at those desserts and wanted to make sure that they were represented. And I just wondered if that was a conversation you had earlier on.
Yeah, no, I think from the very beginning, I knew that it wasn't going to be traditional just because like, I think my background too, even though both my parents are from the Philippines and even though I grew up eating a lot of Filipino food, like all the time, I think my actual baking foundation was really like American style cakes, pastries, and cookies and all of those things that I kind of, in a traditional sense is like obsessed with like Duncan Hines stuff and like Pillsbury, like pre-made frozen cookies and all of that. And so like a lot of the things that I try to do was more so just like kind of use what I had already known, but kind of add fun, more interesting like flavor combinations or sometimes with like the actual foundation of like it was a Filipino dessert traditionally and then adding more like I guess like American style kind of ingredients and twists to them. Like I think in my head there's like this constant exchange or osmosis of both of these like parts of my identity that I wanted to kind of imbue with each dessert. So yeah, like I think what came out was what I intended to do. Surprisingly, I know sometimes it's hard to believe with like you have so many people kind of like both my, agent, editors, all these people at the publisher, you think that they're like, okay, like they want you to make a certain thing, but really like you sign a contract and you write what you want to do and that was agreed upon. So I'm going to do it kind of a thing. And so I'm really glad that me and my editor were really on the same page about it.
And was the recipe list pretty much set in the proposal or did you change a lot as you were creating the book?
Yeah, so actually there wasn't a whole I guess recipe list until it was like a signed contract. It was basically like, oh, we agreed upon 75 recipes. And I think like the first month of January was pretty much like fine tuning first like 6 initial, the big sample recipes that I wanted to show just to show like my writing style and like voice. But also at that time was kind of like narrowing down what I really wanted to make. And the next few months are really just trying to execute that, to be honest.
Yeah. The structure of the book really mirrors your own life. I mean, the chapters are from the various places that your family lived and then later on you yourself lived. And then they're also broken up by different types of baking desserts. And then there are these narrative, nonfiction, memoir-like essays that are scattered throughout. How did that structure come about?
Yeah, so basically it was almost identical to the zine, except for the fact that the short stories were definitely more involved and longer. I don't think I had much or as many as I did like in the original zine. So for Mayumu, I really just wanted to, it's hard because I think there's so much that can be conveyed when a lot of people don't even know me, to be honest. Like I don't have like the biggest following in the world. And so there was so much to like kind of talk about of like why are you writing a cookbook and why are you doing this or like who are you? So I really wanted to answer those kinds of questions, just not just through the recipe head notes, but also through just like being able to talk from my own point of view. And I had discussed with my editor Sarah about like where should we put these? Like I know we discussed that we're definitely writing short stories here. And I think they were just like, like it might be nice to have them kind of scattered throughout, obviously corresponding with like where you lived and what time period that was. But I'm really glad because it's kind of like a nice surprise as you're flipping through the recipes of just like this little like story here and whatever. So if someone is actually like reading the book from start to finish, they can actually get like a little piece of who I am, which I like. I think it's a really nice, like fun structure.
And I think for anybody who would love to be in your shoes, this is a great book to read because you do put so much of where your ideas came, starting with your childhood, but also just, in the introduction, you talk about, the tweed. And then you also talk about just like creating these recipes and why you started working on developing your own recipes during the pandemic. So I think anyone who can take this book, you can read it and you can kind of see sort of like an origin story of a cookbook in addition to getting all these recipes. It's pretty cool that way too.
Yeah, I'm so glad. I mean, I know it's kind of surreal because I know so many people, like work their whole lives and they want to do this and write a book and write a cookbook specifically. But, like when I first started doing it or whenever I first started doing the proposal, I really had, nothing to lose by trying. And I think that was like the spirit that I had throughout the whole process, even though rejection was really tough and so many people said no. So it is kind of that I will be very honest with was really much a downer. I can't like downplay like, confidence levels there.
Right.
But the right people, who knows who's watching, who knows who's reading what you're doing. So I was really glad to just like share that on social media. And literally that's just how it happened that I did get this deal. So I know it's so different, but I think that hopefully that's more of like the nature of how things go for, people who are in the same shoes as me, who aren't technically classically trained or anything, but still want to like write something special because I don't know, there's like a weird, I guess, like pie kind of analogy, that metaphor where, like, oh, there's like limited pieces of pie and there's not enough to go around. But there is plenty of pie. Like there's just like there is no kind of sense of pie shortage in terms of like publishing, I think. I think it's just like a sense of like, okay, you have to have like the right editor to like find you. And that's not necessarily like, everyone is going to like your pie, but someone who, values your pie will buy it and make sure that it gets distributed to everyone else. If that makes sense.
Oh my gosh.
No,
I love
it's beautiful.
That. Yeah.
And we here at Everything Cookbooks, I think, Kate, it's fair to say we're all about abundance mentality.
Yeah,
absolutely.
There's not a scarcity. It's putting it out there and being true to who you are. And
you make your own luck.
Yeah.
Yes. A lot of people have worked for forever and don't get this break, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't get it. So we're super happy and all about that abundance mentality. But speaking of abundance and putting things out there, I want to back up a little bit. And I think we have to say that you still have a full-time job that's not in food.
Yes.
So this is your side hustle, or I don't know. So not only were you starting a blog, but you were doing something else at the beginning of the pandemic when you were tweeting about this cupcake.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that whole thing.
I mean, yeah, to this day, today, right now, I am currently working that same like full-time marketing job that I had as I was starting the blog. So yeah, the intention was never for the blog to become, what it was and what it is now. And it's kind of like one of those like great things, like surprises of life that you just like don't, the best things happen when you don't expect them to. And so like throughout the process of writing the book, I was living with 3 roommates. So there's 4 of us in the apartment total. But that was like the whole duration was like basically testing recipes on my lunch break, going home, like not even going home. I literally work from home, which is great. I'm so glad to work remotely because I know a lot of people have gone hybrid or in person completely. But it was so much of just like kind of, nonstop baking and also writing, but kind of trying my best to balance that with also just like being attentive to my laptop and answering campaigns and answering emails. And I think there was this sense of like, I felt like Hannah Montana, honestly. I was like, okay, there's like my other life is baking. This life is, music marketing. And I'm very grateful for obviously my coworkers who are very understanding and they know that I wrote a cookbook. I can't just like keep it a secret forever or anything. I wouldn't want that. But it's so much of just juggling. And to this day, I'm still juggling my time and trying to figure out how to do it all. But I'm really glad that it happened and I'm still doing things. But I hope that answered the question. I feel like it's too much. There's too much going on.
It's like one of your desserts. There's a lot going on in some of these.
There's a lot going on that's happening behind the scenes that you can't see, but it
Right. It's that like the whole analogy of like the duck looking really calm and then under the water, the feet are going like crazy.
Absolutely. Honestly, every day, like it has not stopped feeling that way.
Oh my gosh. Let me ask you, so you're finally in the thick of actually having a deadline and you've got to get this book done. So can you just tell me what a day would look like? So you're juggling your day job and you have these recipes that you need to develop and test, and you have roommates you're juggling and you need kitchen time. So can you just tell me like an average day in the life of creating this book?
Oh my God. Yes. I mean, I think because it was such a daunting deadline and it was basically like May 1st, I had to have the whole manuscript done. And then we had the cookbook shoot mid-May. I was like, well, game time has to be like this certain set number of recipes a week that I had to do, or at least target number of recipes that I really wanted to accomplish in that amount of time. So on average, it was maybe like, like 6 to 7 a week or something. Or if I could, like, I think there was just a certain period where, the start of the day, it's like, okay, I have to source ingredients. So I have to either go to the grocery store myself or, plan ahead and order something online for something I'm going to test later on in the week. And so there was one aspect of like the cookbook process. And then the other was like writing down like, okay, this is kind of what I think how much I will need for, I guess, like whatever steps need to be done for this recipe I'm working on today. And this is just me typing on anything I could do to like just still be on my laptop, but also, answering my work emails was perfect. I was like, okay, also writing a head note here and there. But at the same time, I was kind of like, okay, like that's done. And then being in the actual kitchen, I was pretty much mostly, it's tough because I was, with roommates. And so I can't just turn on the mixer at like 5 a.m. and I can't turn on the mixer at like 2:30 p.m. when everyone is on a Zoom call and everyone is working remotely. So I really try to be cognizant of recipes I could do during the workday or during the weekday, at least, that was by hand and not with like a mixer. So that was like a weekend bake kind of situation, or a reasonable hour, like 6, 7, 8 p.m. kind of a thing. But yeah, basically just like end work at 6. And then so that's when I really, really get in the kitchen the most. And then I write down notes on my iPhone as I'm going, like that didn't work. Trial number 5 or whatever it was, terrible. That part was overbaked or something. And then I would just like repeat that the next day. And like every day, I think I'm glad I kind of took note of this, but I have some Google Doc where I wrote down my progress every day and I did at least something every day, because every day felt like if I didn't do that, it just seemed like nothing would get, like it felt like you didn't do anything that day, if that makes sense. There's so much that happened, but I'm really, really glad that I did that, because even like the littlest thing, like I sent an email to my editor today and it was like a huge accomplishment, but little by little, that kind of stuff added up. And yeah, but before I knew it, the book was done, or like at least like one draft of it was done. I swear to God, there were so many edits. And that's like a whole nother part of the process I feel like a lot of people don't realize is like, you think you're done when your manuscript is due, but you're so not done at all.
Right. No, it's a whole new project then. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I love that idea of having a Google Doc where you track your progress every day. You say, I did this recipe, or this didn't work, I'll have to redo it, or I sent these emails to the team. I think that's a really great idea. I might start doing that, because I do think sometimes when you're working on a book, it feels too big. Yeah. But if you can look back at this sheet and say, okay, but I got that done. Mm-hmm. It feels more doable, and then you're chipping away every day, you're making progress. That's got to keep the momentum going.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like I literally, even before I started writing, I was like, I read 20 pages of this like baking book just for inspiration or research. And it felt like, even though I had nothing on paper, nothing done, I was like, I'm still working towards something. And I think there's so much of the process that you celebrate the big wins with everyone else, like obviously when it's published, and another thing when you turn in the manuscript initially. But I don't think there's enough of celebrating that internally, of the little things every day that you get done. So I was kind of glad I did that. Not even just like a celebration, it was just a reminder, like, okay, you did something today. Don't worry about it. Don't feel bad.
Right. Because it is a mountain. I mean, it's a big mass, and it can be, I know it can be very overwhelming and to break it down. Did you test all your recipes yourself? Did you have other people help you test?
So for the majority of recipes, it was kind of like the deadline was pretty quick. And so a lot of it was mostly tested by me and some friends, but it was hard to kind of get like a traditional kind of hire a recipe tester situation. Also, budget wise, I was like, oh God, like I don't think I can afford all this.
No, I was wondering how you could fit that in time-wise.
Yeah, it was
Oh, yeah, good
so
point.
tight. But I'm
Yeah.
really glad that like for a lot of things too, I think doing the cookbook first was kind of funny because it felt a lot of backwards of when I actually was starting doing a little bit more freelance writing for other publications. I did a couple recipes or was a guest editor for certain places. Like doing the cookbook was like the first training grounds to do it. And I was like, wow, since you can do a cookbook, you can do anything, and kind of learning how an actual just like one day shoot works versus like after doing 6 in a row, it's like that totally makes so much more sense. Like I'm so glad I did the cookbook, but in a way, I'm like maybe it would make more sense. It was the other way around. If I had done these small one day shoots and done these small tiny recipes every day, that would have made a lot more sense. But it's fun. I think you can't really change how things have turned out for you anyways anymore.
Well, let's get into some of those recipes. Molly, you want to talk about what you were working on earlier this week?
I made your chocolate chip cookies, the adobo chocolate chip
Oh, you
cookies.
did.
I was telling Kate before we started talking that I'm normally like, yeah, give her, sweets. I could make them and put them away and not. Abby, I'm mad at you. I ate so many of those damn cookies.
Oh my
It was like
God.
I couldn't stop eating them. So let's explain it. This is something you do at a couple different occasions throughout the book is you take a classic savory Filipino dish like adobo and you have those flavors inspire a chocolate chip cookie.
Yeah. First of all, I'm so glad no one has told me that they made that recipe yet. So that is such an honor that you made them and you like them. I'm so relieved, honestly.
Not only like them, I couldn't stop eating them, and that doesn't happen to me. But I think there's a couple things going on. But so the butter, you brown the butter with bay leaves, so it's infused brown butter. Brilliant, and I love bay leaf, and I think it doesn't get used enough, and that is just adds this aromatic quality to the cookie that if you didn't tell me what it was, I don't know if I could identify it. But as you eat it, you're like, it's definitely there. There's this bay aroma there, which is an important part of adobo.
Yeah.
And then for salt, you use soy sauce and then a shot of vinegar.
Yeah.
I mean, how many more chocolate chip cookie recipes? I'm like, really? How has nobody ever done that before? And it's so brilliant. It's so brilliant.
Oh my gosh, Molly, thank you so much. That is so kind. And I mean, like, it's funny because one of my friends was just like, I don't get what bay leaf tastes like. I don't think it adds anything to it. I'm like, no, I'll prove you wrong. Because it is like kind of an herbal quality where it's, again, kind of like very subtle initially, but like it builds and it just stays, I guess, is like a kind of nice thing about it. In adobo, like you kind of have so little, like in a traditional adobo, you just literally have soy sauce, vinegar, black peppercorns, bay leaf. And so I really just like wanted to like at least use a lot of those elements and not make it feel like I was, like this is adobo inspired in quotation marks, but it actually is. And I do love that quality about that recipe a lot.
Yeah. Anyways, I was really impressed by those cookies and we'll make them again, I have to say. And something you just said that it triggered so many questions I want to ask you. I think it's the final essay in the book. You talk about your sense of urgency around preserving culture through food. And there's this quote, you say, I used to be so nervous to cook or bake anything Filipino because I knew it wouldn't turn out exactly like my parents' dishes. The moment I accepted that was true, and it didn't mean that what I was making was necessarily worse than their versions, just different. It was so liberating. And it's this idea that adobo was so central to your food growing up, your Filipino food, and you wanted to honor it. It's almost like you're honoring it through a chocolate chip cookie. So it's like, it's very serious, but it's very playful. And it's now getting to know, it's very you too.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thank you. Molly.
Right, Kate?
Yeah, and I would say like what's so great about that quote is it sort of shows why this book is Filipino American. You're not trying to go back and recreate, say, classic Filipino, say, regional desserts or anything like that. This gives you sort of the freedom. You're saying my parents are great cooks, and I'm taking my own capabilities and mashing them together. So I think that's really neat. And I think it's in this essay where you talk about how you were learning traditional Filipino technique through your parents through Zoom. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because it sounds like you spent all this time, like you were baking up a storm since you were 13, but a lot of it was, say, American or European inspired or Great British Baking Show style type of thing. Tell us a little bit how you actually learned Filipino technique.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a shameful thing to admit, but like, I think I really, again, didn't start really making anything Filipino at all until pretty much the pandemic. That urgency was kind of desperation. It felt like, because I felt like it was a now or never kind of thing where if I didn't learn this now, then when else would I? And so lucky for technology, because if I couldn't have FaceTime my parents or Zoom called them, I just don't think there's so much that's like oral tradition in like Filipino cuisine, and a lot of like first generation, I think, like kids and like really understand that about, our parents are just like kind of like, a dash of this and a little bit of that. And I'm just like, God, that's not helpful right now for me, for my purposes right now. So I am one of those people that kind of, went to restaurants mostly and ate out a lot and like went home and my parents cooked for me. And then I didn't really ask any other questions except, you just have a full stomach. So you're happy and content. But yeah, the pandemic was a game changer and my parents live in California and I live here. So I just like was very desperate and hungry and craving all those flavors that I had grown up with. And also just like a lot of the dishes that I kind of knew were also just learned primarily from the internet baking, like not baking blogs, but Filipino food blogs are great for that because my parents, again, didn't have measurements, but from what I could, FaceTime them with or Zoom, it was more like, does this look right to you? Is this toasted coconut curd like brown, too brown, light brown? Like, is it supposed to be darker? So visual cues were mostly the things that I could get from them and kind of just like, this tastes like this. Is this right? It is very difficult when you can't just have smell-o-vision anymore, or you can't have like literally not anymore. We never had it, but I think
right, we never had. Maybe someday,
we should have had it
whether we want
now.
it or not.
That's what I'm saying. But I kind of just made the best of the situation that this is a pandemic, and we're still in it, and it's just so tough to kind of go back home and have done that. Which I kind of wish, if it were different circumstances, I wish I could have just gone home and not disturbed all my roommates and their work calls, but it is what it is again. Another one of those things.
Well, I also think for your generation too, the pandemic hit when you were but you were just a couple of years out on your own too. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, those ties were already stretched and now just couldn't go home. So I think it was even more acute in many ways.
Yeah, I still cannot believe like when it was the beginning of the pandemic, I was 24, turned 25, April 2020 with like a Zoom birthday call, like, which was terrible. Mm-hmm. Like all these, like not terrible, but it was just so hard. Yeah, that was like such a pivotal time of life. And I think everyone feels robbed of the past few years.
Yeah.
But it's just so hard to kind of like imagine that like, there is some sense of semblance of some type of happiness coming out of this kind of gloom and tunnel. I hope for the future to be as bright or better than 2020.
Better.
Talk about brightness. I mean, this book, which is born from the pandemic, is filled with brightness and joy and lots of sweet and gooey and salty and crunchy. We were talking
and you're
about
going to get Molly to bake. This is like huge. I mean, not that you don't bake.
I don't bake. Yeah, you got me to bake.
A miracle. Again, so honored. Like the best thing I heard all week. Like I'm so shook because I know that the recipe itself, it does take a bit of time. You kind of let the flavors ferment for a day in the fridge and you let them meld. But you really took the time and I really appreciate that.
Oh, and I've flagged a whole bunch more things. I'm really taken by the flavors. I mean, it's very much a Filipino, the play between sweet and sour and fishy that is in savory, but you're playing it with it in sweet. And you're also doing this, you use the term mix up and mash up. And earlier in this interview, you said Frankenstein, but you do this cultural mashup. So it's not just American Filipino, but you've also got, there's Japanese, there's Chinese, there's the pork floss, there's the rugula from Zabar's, there's tiramisu, there's panna cotta. Your influences and flavors are wide ranging. It's just exciting to sort of read through it.
Right.
Thank you.
We have to ask you about the floating islands. Can you tell us about how you came up with the floating island with a salted duck egg creme on glaze? How did that come about? I've never seen this before, so I'm curious how those flavors came together.
Oh yeah, of course. Like this recipe, I was really stressed about this, honestly. This is probably one of the more like technically advanced ones that I was like, I've never done this before. Let's try it. And I'm glad it worked out. My parents, like this original recipe that it's inspired by, it's called braso de Mercedes. And it's kind of like a traditional Filipino dessert where the meringue is baked and then like in the middle is like a custard from the egg yolk. So you're using both parts of the egg white and the yolk and you roll it up and it's basically like this white and yellow Swiss roll, but just meringue, like no extra flour or anything, no extra gluten. So it is like nice and custardy, but also has like kind of like lemon meringue pie situation, but not that's a horrible thing. That's a horrible kind of, comparison there. But if you get a sense of, obviously meringue and custard, this is what it is basically. But like my parents infamously, like they really struggled with this recipe. I remember them trying this at home and they got all the stuff from Michael's. They got like the cake comb thing to make the ridges around the outside of like the Swiss roll, brazo de Mercedes thing. And it just didn't work out for them. And I think the curd curdled, everything went wrong. And so I think I like carried that kind of fear. And I was like, I don't think I could do it then. Like, to be honest with you, I was like, I don't want to try this recipe as traditionally as it was done. Cause I know there's a lot of pitfalls where we could go wrong here. And I don't know why, but I was like, okay, maybe, but I think floating islands are more achievable somehow, just because I felt more comfortable poaching the meringue than like baking it. I was just worried like baking the meringue would be more eggy. Like I have no idea. I was like, I'm so scared. I don't want it rubbery. At least I was just nervous about that. And so it was just like the structure is very different, but the flavors are very similar to what I was trying to achieve with that other recipe. Because the only other tweak in there was basically using like salted duck egg yolk for the creme anglaise, just because I wanted a little bit more saltiness. The traditional recipe is just very straightforward. Is I think the most flavor you'll probably get is maybe vanilla extract if it's even added. So I definitely just really love like sweet and salty, and it's already very eggy dessert. So I was like, oh yeah, salted duck egg yolk makes sense to me. And when I was in the Philippines, sometimes like I'd see menus for like dessert menus, and they would use salted duck egg for ice cream. So I was like, oh yeah, if then that makes sense for like a creme anglaise because it's just the sauce. And if you whip that and you churn it and you freeze it, it would be ice cream. So yeah, that was kind of like the thought process of that dessert. Actually doing like the sponge sugar balls. Oh my God, that was like the messiest thing I had ever done to my kitchen. I still think I'm like scraping off caramel. And I literally cut myself, I think, when I was like accidentally, because it's sharp. And I was like, oh my God, like there was some piece that I had forgot about, or just like, again, make that dessert, obviously with caution. You probably won't make that same like rookie mistake I did when I first tested this recipe, but it is fun and it is a showstopper kind of a thing to make for people coming over. But I love that it does take the components of what it was, but you can distinctly kind of see that it's a little bit different, but you know where the inspiration is at least.
One of the things that's great about your book is the beginning you talk about this is how you cook in a small kitchen space that you're sharing with roommates. I mean, I love your tips in there, and I've never read this in cookbooks before where you say, count to yourself when you're measuring so you stay focused. Or, if your roommates haven't done the dishes, do the dishes first so you have a clean slate. Like you just have all these like great tips to think. So if you can do these recipes in your shared kitchen spaces, like anybody should be able to make these recipes is kind of the promise, right?
Yeah, I hope so. And the latter one about, washing dishes of other people, I know that was probably, desperate times when it's like everyone is gone. Like obviously the best way to do this would probably be like have a sit down house conversation, roommate conversation here and be like, can you please do the dishes? But I am very conflict avoidant. So usually I will just go surpass that completely and just wash the dishes. But then I'll bring it up later. So I think, what you have to do, you kind of like make it work with what you have. And I think that was like the sense of the book itself, the process behind the scenes, but what I wanted to convey in that section, especially for Tiny Kitchen Essentials.
Yeah. And also if you're using the dirty dishes as I have done and, or looking for obstacles for why I'm not getting something done, I'm like, well, I can't get this done because the dishes are dirty or because I only have one oven or because, it's like maybe I'm just making up excuses. So sometimes, like you said, if you're trying to do 6 or 7 recipes a week, develop and test and write, and you have a full-time job, that's a lot. And you don't have time for a roommate summit to discuss whose dirty skillet that is. You just need to get through the day.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just got to just power through is what I'm saying.
Talking about that floating island, a lot of your recipes have multi-components. I mean, some of them are simpler, but there's also not a fear of these multi-component recipes. I think of the Alo Ala Halo Halo Baked Alaska that's on the cover, that's got a sponge cake, it's got a meringue, it's got all these elements. And I also really noticed there's this thread of your craving or your taste for texture, that you really seem to love to add texture to your creations, whether it's through crunch like the coconut curd, or there's chicharrones on a crumble. I mean, it's like a basic fruit crisp, but it's made with melon. And then there's chicharrones. There's just a lot. And these gooey glazes, there's a lot of extra in your recipes.
Yes.
It's an intense level of creativity is what I get from it.
Oh, thank you. I know it's kind of good and bad in the sense where sometimes there's so much that I want in something. But like, what I try my best for the book is for people to find it at least somewhat digestible. I know that like in the Halo Halo Baked Alaska, for example, it's probably the longest recipe in the whole book. But like, I'm like, you can use like store-bought ice cream. I use store-bought ice cream when I made this recipe. That's totally fine. And the coconut sponge, it's interesting because in development, like, I think I definitely was like, for a lot of base recipes, you kind of have the same. If you read some of the recipes, they do have, similar, but like literally this exact same shortbread recipe, but then done with a different glaze or done with like a slightly different kind of like filling or something. So the cake also has kind of like reappeared in certain parts of the recipe, but it's kind of like hopefully that you'll see that like as long as you kind of have like, base core kind of recipes that you kind of can go back to, then you can build on that. And that's kind of like the philosophy. I hope that even though there are certain ones with multiple components, that it's something that someone can at least see and like, oh, I saw that before, but just, slightly different. So I think that level of familiarity hopefully helps people feel more comfortable with kind of tackling some things that they've never tried before or even tasted before.
Mm-hmm.
And can you talk a little bit about how the idea for the glossary in the back of the book evolved? Because what's really interesting, a lot of times if you have a cookbook, a glossary, it's just like names of food or definitions of different culinary techniques. But there's a lot of different words in the glossary.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely something I talked to with my editor about, just because it's hard sometimes when I'm Filipino American, and then my editor, Sarah, is actually Asian American, Korean American. So even though, we have definitely similar experiences of some sort, for non-Filipinos, I definitely wanted this to still be somewhat accessible. And there's certain words that I would say, or I think you would know this a lot, Kate, just because you lived in the Philippines for a bit, but like older sister, we'd say like ate is like an honorific before their name. So it's more of like a sign of respect. You're like ate Kate, ate Molly kind of a thing. But it's funny because like in the glossary, I would have to say that just because it looks like ate. So I ate Molly and I ate Kate. And that's not exactly what I meant at all. And also because it was things that I, again, didn't think of because it's come so naturally to me. This is just like my life and what I grew up with. But obviously it's good to have someone who is, again, like a non-Filipino perspective to kind of be like rein you in and be like, not necessarily like never sugarcoat what you're saying and never like take away what you're saying, but just make it make sense. And like, I think that was a really fine balance of just not whitewashing what I was doing, but also, still at least having it somewhat be understandable to the masses. So I'm really glad that my editor was really good about like, oh, I don't know this. Can you explain? And not in like a bad way. It was so much more for the benefit of the book than anything.
Right.
Like a respectful way without taking the words out and having it sort of whitewashed into the, auntie or whatever word sort of. But I loved it with Lola. When I was a kid, my grandmother came to visit and she loved how everyone called her Lola. So we just called her Lola. And then now my brother and sister have kids and she's Lola. So we've taken she's just like, Lola sounds so much better than grandma.
So wholesome. I love that.
Yeah, she'll love that.
Yeah. It makes sense hearing you talk about how the glossary came about and also how you didn't have to or you weren't pressured to add a lot of English words to the recipe titles and the headnotes, where if someone doesn't know Filipino language, they might not know what was going on. So, but it would have broken the continuity to have to see all these either italics or parentheses or, and so just putting the glossary in there seems to have solved that problem in a way that really kept the integrity of what you were trying to say.
Yeah.
So it seems like it really works.
I also feel like it was really helpful because I also had my friend Therese do illustrations for the book. So I definitely wanted more than just a glossary, but also visual cues for people to kind of dissect more complicated recipes. Where like, okay, like this is a kare-kare peanut butter cookie. Some people might not have ever had kare-kare, which is like a Filipino peanut butter stew. And so it was really nice that like I definitely tapped her to kind of highlight these kinds of inspirations. So it didn't feel like it came out of nowhere and it felt more, I guess, approachable in that sense with her work.
I love the illustrations too. They really add so much to this book, and I also really appreciated how you have the pantry section in the front, and you very rarely offer substitutions. It's like, this is what you need to make this, and you either make it or you don't, and they're not required. So it just, again, I feel like you were able to really write the book you wanted to write. You mentioned those illustrations and the way they really go with the design of the book. And the design is just so bright and cheerful and fun. And I'm curious how that whole process, the design, and you referenced the photo shoot being a 6-day shoot, but if we could talk a little bit about how those all came together.
Yes. For my team, we had an interior designer, Leah from Harvest, who I was really happy to work with. Outside of just like the recipe photos, there's obviously like kind of like little flower that you want to see when it's actually story to break it up, or just gradients and graphics that aren't necessarily photographs or illustrations for my friend. And so like when they had asked, like, what are you seeing for the book? Obviously bright, colorful, fun is kind of like what was on the mood for it. But I gave her, my thing is like, this is very random, but I really love, there's an artist, Mary Blair, who did the work for It's a Small World, a lot of like Disney mock-ups for very early movies like Cinderella, Peter Pan. So I love like mid-century, like kind of modern, fun little Art Deco designs and everything. And so I really looked to that. I want this inspiration here. And it's, again, kind of matches with like nostalgic, playful, and very childlike in a sense of where my headspace was. I was definitely missing Disneyland and all these things like during the pandemic, to be honest. And so that was definitely one of the core inspirations for the inside of the book. For the outside, on top of interior design, you have like the cover designer, the book cover designer. So Mumtaz was my cover designer. Again, during the photo shoot, you kind of say, this is kind of what I'm thinking would be a good cover. So you have multiple options. You just don't want to like put all your eggs in one basket. But I think from the very beginning, I really thought the Holla Holla Baked Alaska was kind of the star of the book, the thing that I think people would really gravitate towards. So we shot, obviously other recipes too, but having that photo, at least a cross section, kind of really made sense to like the whole team. But it was kind of like on a grayish backdrop in the actual photo shoot. So they totally photoshopped that out to make it so much more brighter in the green shade. We talked at length about the font. We were like, this is the most important like 6-letter word. Like you have to make it. And, it was funny because like I kept saying like, that's not funky enough. And I get not a designer background at all. I'm like, it's just not hitting. I don't know what to say. Like there were so many things like non-verbally to kind of express and be like, it just doesn't feel like me. And so much is like intuition. And all these people have never met me in real life before. We've had Zoom calls together. But I think overall they got it. And I kind of was like consulting and being like, I want this or this. And like, think of this. So many mood boards. You just make so many mood boards and you hope for the best what people think
So
about.
you were making the mood boards. You were making the mood boards and then sharing it with them?
Yes. So I definitely made mood boards for the photography. I made mood boards for also the illustrations. But more so, I guess, like the mood boards can be either as formal, informal as you want. Sometimes I'll just like send pictures to my friend Charisse, who's doing illustrations, like this is what I want, kind of like think sulfide acid heat, kind of. But like, like all these things.
Right.
You definitely have need a point of reference for people to kind of get where you're coming from to make something completely new.
That's great advice.
Yeah, that's really valuable advice because I think a lot of times a designer might not know. You might hate this color and then the first cover they show you is like the font is in that color or the font makes your name look funny or something. But if you haven't had a communication, you haven't shown them what you really kind of love, they might just be like, so I think that's really smart that you were just like really visually focused on this book as well. Yeah. That's good advice.
I get a real like Yellow Submarine vibe from the
just a 60s. I tried something 60s retro kind of feel.
And when you make these mood boards, you mentioned sometimes you're just texting photos to your friend who is doing the illustrations, but would you use something like Pinterest or is there something you would use to create them?
Mostly, I do have a Pinterest, but I'm not as active on there as I'd like to be. But so I basically did it all on Google Slides. I just like threw photos on. And so it doesn't really have to be so like stylized or perfect. You literally just need photos like this is kind of what I like and like lighting, especially for photography where you see a lot of modern cookbooks and kind of the style is very bright already and kind of like harsh lighting, which I do like. I love that. I was like, I want this still, or like it really gave my photographer Nico a sense of like, she doesn't want like, I guess not outdated, but sometimes some things can be just very minimalist. And I'm like, I like that, but also want a little bit more of something. Obviously don't detract from the recipe, but I love a little bit of props. And that's also talking to my prop stylist. I needed a mood board for that. And so there's so much that went into it.
And I think in creating mood boards, at least my experience is that as you build them, and the Google Slides is a great way to do it, as you build them, you start to feel it too. Like you might not even know, you put up a few pictures or images and you don't realize until you put one up that doesn't go, that you're like creates itself as you build it.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the lighting, and one of the things that I take away from this is that I'm sure it's influenced by the narrative, but also to me, the mood is, it's got a distinct California vibe, but there's a New York edge to it too. And so that, is very much reflected who you are.
Oh, thank you. No, I really tried to like toe a balance. A lot of it too was like so many cookbooks that I love that are Filipino cookbooks were kind of more so on very tropical leaning, super, super tropical. And I love accents like that, like banana leaves and, obviously the fresh fruit if I could have it. But I definitely wanted to make it a sense of, I live in New York and this is kind of more so, I guess, like true to like, I guess like me and a little bit more modern. Yeah, all that went into the thought of like the mood boards and everything like that too.
Yeah. Did you have a target audience when you were writing, or even today, do you have a sense of who your book is for?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the get-go, I was like, I think this is primarily, of course, like my audience that I love to reach the most is Filipino American communities across like the country. But honestly, the diaspora is so large, like people who are Filipino live everywhere globally. So I really hope that this kind of struck a chord with obviously the community that I represent. But at the same time, I think there's so much that anyone can get from it who's just a baker, like whatever their background is. And I think a lot of it, in the process of doing the proposal, especially if you don't have a big following like I do and did, it was a lot of, I'm sure this could like reach these people. Trust me. Like, I know like there's some type of, demand for this from what I could say and what I could write. That's all I could convey was like, have faith in this project. It's going to be great. And I'm lucky that I do have friends and I do have people who have been following me that kind of see that and have taken that kind of thinking, like, or at least my baking kind of point of view with them, even though they're not Filipino. Sometimes I love when people are first generation like me and then they pull kind of inspiration from their families, like kind of recipe boxes, but mix it up with some type of like American junk food hostess kind of vibe. So I am 100% for it. And I think it's really cool that there's this kind of like this avenue for people to express their creativity through baking. And that's all I kind of want. And even if it's not necessarily like my recipes, like I'm glad that people are in the kitchen doing what they like to do and experimenting, because that's the vibe that I was trying to give off anyways.
Yeah, I love it. It's so much creativity and so many ideas to explore in here that I think anybody picking it up will just be like, oh, like Molly. Now I'm thinking soy sauce and chocolate chip cookies makes so much sense. And why didn't I think of that? Can't wait to try that one.
I'm making those caramels next, I think.
Yes, let me know how those go. I'm so excited for you.
Yeah, I am too. Abby, before we let you go, and you've been so generous with your time, but are there any recipes that we've talked about, a couple that I've tried or going to try, but that listeners might, you want to point them to if they're new either to baking and or to Filipino desserts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's one that I know that sometimes people are like, I'm not a baker. I don't really know how to do anything. And I feel so scared about baking. I think there's one dessert that's literally no bake, literally just like open cans and like put it in the fridge. So there's like a Fiesta fruit salad that I love. Fruit salad is such like a big, it's definitely something where it's like come from obviously colonial ties of like America and just that influence, but it's fruit cocktail basically and like canned fruits that I kind of select. Originally it is like plain straight up fruit cocktail and then like cream and then condensed milk and then you just like mix it together. But I just love that recipe. I think it's easy and it feeds like people for a party. And I just like that it's so refreshing. And there is an ease to like Filipino desserts that even though a lot of the flavors that I've been talking about and everything else are kind of complex, I still think that it necessarily don't have to like put in all this effort to make something great. So I love that recipe. I think it's a showstopper for people who don't bake at all. You literally can open a can. I know you can open a can. So that is one. And then I guess another one that I really love that kind of shows a bit about Filipino desserts traditionally is kind of the kakanin chapter. And there's one that's like the strawberry shortcake sapin sapin. Sapin sapin is basically a layered type of like mochi-like dessert. That's like a rice cake that's steamed. So you steam each layer and then you add on the toasted coconut curds, latik that we were talking about earlier, and freeze-dried strawberry powder. So it has a lot of very traditional American flavors of strawberry, but that dish originally, it's like ube makapuno, which is like a coconut, and then also jackfruit. So it's fun to kind of like swap out and swap in. And that's very emblematic, I guess, of like the ethos of the book. So I hope people can turn to those recipes and feel like they can accomplish like Filipino baking.
That's great. I know I said that was the last question,
No,
but do you think you might write another cookbook?
You don't even have to cut out that audio.
You don't have to answer that.
No. I mean, I definitely feel like right now, who knows? Like, I never say never. I never tried to, limit myself to what I'm feeling right now. But I'm happy with how this book turned out. And I think
that's great. There's
so many more things in my head that are, I guess, like, you can also apply this kind of thing to like Filipino just cooking. So obviously there could be like Filipino American, whatever, savory dishes remixed. But I'm not like proposing a sequel immediately or anything. But I love that hopefully this is just like a jumping board for other people who are Filipino, British, Filipino, Australian. Like, there's so many different points of views that I think obviously also traditional. Like, I think hopefully this opens up avenues for everyone else who is doing what I'm doing, but in their own way, because I don't think mine is the only way to do it. And I try to stress that because I know it's not traditional. And I think I get a lot of flack sometimes from people who are like, this is not, what is this? This is not Filipino at all. But I do try my best to honor what I know, but making it my own at the same time. So yeah, I just don't know for sure about a sequel, but I want other people to make cookbooks. I want other people to add to my collection because mine is just one of many that stand on the shoulders of giants.
That's a very generous answer.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Molly. This is so nice. Y'all asked such great questions. I am astounded by how much you've read of the book and already baked from it. So thank you so much.
Well, we love cookbooks, and we love that you've added to our cookbook collections. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to contact us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your audio. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. Any books mentioned in the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thank you, as always, to our editor, Abby Circatella. And until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.